These are intercontinental ballistic missiles flying over the atmosphere just minutes before hitting their target. As improbable this scenario was 20 years ago, each day we have become closer and closer to it. Why? The answer is the Thucydides trap, and it shows us how history is telling us that we have a 75% chance of seeing a nuclear exchange in the next few years. So why did we go from a safe geopolitical world to be on this precipice? Almost 2,500 years ago, two ancient powers suddenly found themselves at war. Athens and Sparta, former allies against the Persian Empire, fought for hegemony over the Greek world. The war would last for 27 years and shake the foundations of what was, at the time, international order. Sparta, despite being victorious, was left in such a weakened state that it allowed for new players such as Thebes and Macedon to emerge and challenge its position as the hegemon. But what caused the war between former allies? Thucydides says it was the rise of Athens and the fear that it caused Sparta. Wars between rising and current hegemons are so frequent that historians have given that phenomenon a name: the Thucydides trap. But can this trap be avoided? The historic data shows us that the transition of power between hegemonic countries, in our case between the US and China, have ended up in a major war 12 out of 16 times. America's unipolar moment is over. Its power is diminishing and being challenged by aspiring nations all over the world. But the greatest challenge comes from China, rapidly expanding its economic and military potential. China's economy has become the second largest in the world, and its companies compete with American counterparts for markets and resources. The People's Liberation Army has become the pacing threat to American military operations in Asia, and China's diplomatic influence rivals that of the United States in many parts of the world. But before China can become a great superpower, it will have to, firstly, become a regional hegemon. In a region littered with the US allies and military bases, that will be no easy task. We are on the verge of a new war that could completely destroy the world as we know it. And the thing is, almost nobody is taking it seriously. People are unable to comprehend how the US-China competition could ignite the Third World War. But the perception that the war is unlikely won't stop the invisible forces that are guiding the US and China towards conflict. After all, in 1914, few could imagine the slaughter on a scale that demanded a new category: World War. For those reasons, the defining question about global order for this generation is whether China and the United States can escape the Thucydides trap. The great power theory implies that dramatic shift in the global distribution of power exponentially increases the risk of conflict. That shift is already happening. In 2013, US and UK claimed that Assad's army used chemical weapons in eastern Ghouta, killing thousands and crossing Obama's self-imposed red line. However, contrary to all expectations, Obama decided not to use military force against Syria, that the United States backed down from a geopolitical decision. It became clear to everyone that the world was no longer unipolar. Following year, Russia annexed Crimea. Years later, it launched a military intervention in Syria that saved Assad's regime. From that point onward, the US was repeatedly challenged all over the world. But no challenger has the political, economic, and military potential of China. In 2022, Chinese GDP was $17.3 trillion, 73% of the GDP of the United States. Recently, China's economy has been slowing down, but it's nonetheless expected to overcome the US in the following decade. But the economy isn't the only area where China is rapidly catching up. It has dramatically increased its military budget. In 2022, it amounted to almost $300 billion. But here's the catch: China hides the actual amount of money it spends on defense. U.S. Senator Dan Sullivan recently revealed that the U.S. government estimates put China's annual defense budget spending at a whopping $700 billion. That is just $100 billion away from the U.S. budget. Nowhere has this rise in military spending been felt more than in the People's Liberation Navy. China understands that if it wants to become a world superpower, it needs its naval capabilities to match those of the United States. Its navy is still weaker. It has only 3 aircraft carriers, but it is catching up fast. But does the military buildup make the war between China and the United States really inevitable? To answer that question, we just need to carefully look at the events that are currently unfolding. There are wars and crisis hotspots all over the globe, from the Middle East and Ukraine to Guyana. Crisis and conflict on the periphery are the best indicator of the changing international system and the diminishing power of former hegemon. As it transitions from unipolar to multipolar, the system becomes increasingly unstable as states struggle to contain the destructive forces from tearing the system from within. The United States simply does not possess the adequate resources anymore to restore order. The number of wars and crises on the periphery is the best indicator that a major war is going to break out soon. But why is it going to happen in the next 5 years? There will be no better time for China to attack and take over Taiwan than in the next few years. With the wars in Ukraine and Gaza and tensions with the Houthis in Iran, the US are stretched thin. Russian invasion of Ukraine has completely emptied NATO's weapon stocks. The fact that Ukraine is losing Western support and is most likely going to lose the war might embolden President Xi to order the invasion. With simultaneous crises all over the world, the U.S. Navy could deploy only a portion of its force to combat China. That way, it would be a much fairer fight for the still weaker Chinese Navy. Also, China needs to act before the U.S. is able to form a regional alliance to counter its influence. Just like it did with the USSR during the Cold War, the U.S. is trying to form a broad coalition that would contain China. Washington has made several steps in that direction, from courting India to forming a trilateral security pact with the UK and Australia. Japan, China's regional and historical rival, has also deepened its security ties with Taiwan. Current developments in East Asia are extremely negative for China, and the longer it waits, the harder it will be to achieve its goals. In 2021, Philip Davidson, then chief of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, warned that China might attack by 2027. He said that Xi Jinping expects the PLA to have the necessary capabilities to attack and occupy Taiwan by that time frame. Considering the fact that at the time he made that warning, Russia didn't attack Ukraine yet, and there wasn't a major crisis in the Middle East, we can assume that Xi Jinping has even more incentives to invade now. The U.S. will have to support Taiwan in some way. If it stands idle while China occupies the island, it will irreversibly tarnish its reputation and send a message to its allies that the U.S. is not going to defend them. However, the loss of face is the least of its concerns. If the U.S. loses Taiwan, it will lose a vital card in dealing with China. Taiwan's strategic position offers unique possibilities in containing China's military potential in the region. Therefore, looking from a Chinese perspective, isn't it better to attack now, when the US and NATO are already busy with 2 major conflicts in Gaza and Ukraine? But if the US and China end up at war, how is that war going to be fought? It is hard to imagine how a war between 2 superpowers could be fought only by conventional means. It doesn't take much for a situation to spiral out of control and nuclear weapons be put to use. If any side gets close to being decisively defeated, it will surely resort to the nuclear option. With the prospects of war so grim, a question arises whether the war is truly unavoidable. Is there a way that the US and China could escape the Thucydides trap? After all, there were 4 instances in history where hegemonic competition didn't result in a major war. Good news for the US and the entire world is that China has a strategy of peaceful rise. It is to avoid conflict at all costs until it becomes powerful enough that any prospect of war with it becomes fruitless. Legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party resides on its ability to provide high rates of economic growth. As long as the economy is booming and people are getting richer, They are not going to question CCP's monopoly on power. The problem is, the US isn't adjusting its behavior by continuously escalating tensions with China. It's forcing its hand regarding Taiwan as it doesn't want China to acquire hegemony in Asia, as that will mean world hegemony. So, the only way World War III can be avoided is if the US peacefully abandons its hegemonic policy and cedes control of the Asia-Pacific to China, and that doesn't look like an option.